Thank you for the welcome. That's lovely. It's always good to be out and about talking to members, and it's good to be here at the branch. You are privileged because I'm just up the road. You don't have to sort of book me weeks in advance and have me fly to visit. I want to cover the Social Workers Registration Legislation Bill, and I want you to just take the last part of the mission statement and keep that in your mind as I work through some of the slides. Social work is a valued profession. I think we can probably argue that right now, at the moment, it isn't as valued by the politicians and officials as we would like it to be. First up, I'm going to cover some of the key issues before I go into the longer story about challenging the legislation and what's actually happening. So there will be a 2-year transition from the date of royal assent. So that if the bill was to get royal assent on Monday, there would be 2 years before everybody had to be registered. So if people are not currently registered and thinking about it, they've got a bit of time. There's planned to be a 5-year transition for people who are applying for Section 13. That in itself is problematic, because to call yourself a social worker, you have to be registered in that 2-year time frame. So for people applying for Section 13, they're going to have to do some jiggery-pokery to cover that extra 3-year period that people can apply for Section 13s, and that will be a piece of policy work on the part of SWRB. From the day after the bill gets royal assent, New Zealand graduates will not require a certificate of competence to register. So that will go. Overseas graduates will still have to go through the process that's in place now. So they will do an overseas competence assessment, come to New Zealand, do 2,000 hours of supervised practice, 10 hours of PD around competence to work with Māori, 10 hours of PD around competence to work with diverse cultures and ethnicities, and then they do a full competence assessment. All registered social workers will be absolved from the necessity to do a recertification of competence every 5 years. That part of the Act will be repealed. None of the submissions to Select Committee challenged any of these things, so there's no reason why they won't go through as they are. One of the things, and if you've got colleagues in this space, please tell them. Currently, under the provisional registration requirements, you can be practicing and studying a recognised program concurrently. Once the bill gets royal assent, that opportunity disappears and goes. So if you are currently practicing but don't have a qualification and want to remain known as a social worker and be able to practice as a social worker, you need to get enrolled in a recognised program before the bill gets royal assent, because as a provisionally registered social worker, you will just transfer across into the new regime and you'll have 8 years to complete your degree. If you don't get that underway before royal assent, you will have to stop working as a social worker, complete your degree, and then come back into the profession. So it's actually a really critical message. Professional development. We all know that recertification is going, and recertification is based around professional development and submission of professional development logs. All of us in National Office would get at least one call a day, if not more, saying, I don't need to do PD anymore because I'm not due to recertify till 2021, and so I don't need to do my logs. Sorry, I've got bad news. Professional development will continue to be a requirement of registration and holding an APC. You will be signing a declaration each year when you renew your APC to say you are meeting or working to meeting the PD requirements and that you are recording your PD in a log. So that will continue. In the meantime, the minimum of 20 hours per year will be the requirement. But in the meantime, it must be recorded on a PD log. And you'll be hopefully aware that there's a new PD log available from us and SWRB that has collapsed the reflection on learning and the reflection on core competencies practice standards into one column, and the requirement for manager supervisor critical feedback has been removed. So the manager supervisor signs a declaration at the end of the 12-month period to say that you've actually done that PD. If you have already recorded your PD on the old log, that's okay, and that can be submitted if you get called for an audit. You don't need to copy and paste onto a new log. And for the next 5 years, SWRB will accept our logs as well as their logs, which they haven't done up till now. Random audits of a sample of PD logs is likely to take place. They're talking in terms of 15 to 20% of practicing registered social workers. There is talk, and what it ends up in policy, I don't know, something like 5 or 7 days from receipt of notification to submit your logs. So the advice I would have to everyone is keep your logs up to date in real time. And a really cool way to do that is to put an appointment in your Outlook calendar, say every month, every 2 months, update my PD log. And that way you're just making sure it's kept up to date. The other kind of time frame I've heard for submission of logs when they're called for audit is 2 months. So we're looking at something between 5 days and 2 months. The other thing that we're talking with our insurers about is having audit insurance. So if you get stood down because you've got to pull your PD log together, and say it's the 5-day time frame, and you think, oh my God, I haven't done it for 5 years and it's going to take me a week to do it, there would be a small payment to cover the fact you've had to take some time off work to do it. But that's sort of in the negotiation phase at the moment. Registered social workers will continue to need to undertake PD that covers all the 10 core competencies over a 5-year period. So at the moment, it's just shifting from PD, from recertification as we know it, to PD. You don't have to do 10 hours on each core competence. You need to do sufficient hours to be able to do a substantial critical reflection. And that is assessed as being around 4 to 5 hours. It would be the minimum you're looking at. There'll be some competencies you will do 10 hours or more than 10 hours, and others you might struggle to even get to the 4, but that's the kind of how it pans out. Just to keep us on our toes, SWRB are reviewing the core competencies next year. Currently there are 10. They'll probably be simplified, and there may not be 10. We don't know until the review's done. And that will be done ahead of reviewing program recognition standards, which is a regular cycle of review that has to be done under the legislation. They're also researching best practice around the demonstration of competence in the absence of the formal competence assessment. So I think in about 12 to 18 months, we may see some changes in what's required in terms of professional development, how it's reported and what you might need to be doing. One model they have looked at and they like is the Australian model, where you have to do 10 hours, demonstrate 10 hours of supervision in 12 months, demonstrate 15 hours around skill and knowledge development, and 5 hours on professional practice. So that's sort of coming to these sort of events, coaching social workers, all of that sort of stuff. So those are just some of the key things. Is there anything else there that you want clarified or have got questions about? No?
Can I just ask on the previous slide, is it still expected that this bill will go through? When is that royal assent? I know it's
crystal ball.
Crystal ball.
Crystal ball.
We're really hopeful for this year. Is that still 80% if we want to?
Can I answer that question when we get towards the end? Because what I'm going to be covering next is sort of germane to how that question gets answered. And if I forget, just come back to me. Okay, so let's just look at the journey, remembering that part of the mission statement. Social work is a valued profession. From April 2017, the reference to social workers in the Oranga Tamariki Act, or you might know it as the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act, was removed. Minister Tolley, the Minister of Social Development of the day, didn't like social workers. So this was one way of kind of taking them out of the scene. So and now the Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki must intentionally delegate powers to social workers under that Act. Back in the day, you were employed as a social worker, you automatically had the powers. You now have to be delegated them. But significantly, the Chief Executive can delegate powers to people who are not social workers. And it only needs to take into account the person's training, experience and interpersonal skills. There is no requirement for those people to have a tertiary qualification, any understanding about the sorts of things that Oranga Tamariki want of their staff, which is human development, knowledge and skill around mental health, knowledge and skill around drug and alcohol, capacity to write reports. So these people have got powers around things like removal of children. So that is a significant degradation of the social work profession, in my view. So we see it's been around for a while. In July 2016, so this was a year before the changes to the Oranga Tamariki Act, the Social Services, Minister Tolley asked that the Social Work Registration Act be reviewed by the Select Committee in advance of its normal 5-yearly review cycle that it has to go through. So was that a question? No? So the association got involved, submitted to Select Committee. We supported mandatory registration. We opposed restricting registration to titles because that would limit the number of people who would need to register, and that'll become obvious down the track. We supported the global definition of social work as being part of the legislation. We supported the removal of competence and recertification, and we supported the development of a much clearer and more transparent fitness to practice assessment model. The Select Committee report comes out, and we all felt quite hopeful. Things are looking good. This is some of the key recommendations. So it was all around mandatory registration of all social workers, protection of title, scopes of practice, and the removal of competence. So all of those things were kind of on the table, and we all thought, great. So then what happened? The regulatory impact statement, and this is a statement that's developed by the Ministry of Social Development as part of preparation for legislation. So what the Ministry has to do is consult with all government departments that are affected by the change in the legislation or potential change in legislation. So Ministry of Social Development has quite a big voice here. The stated aim was to have a skilled workforce in which all social workers were registered. It was seen as part of the government strategy for improving the lot of children. They opted for the certification model, which was good. That is regulation by the profession. So in a certification model, you have an agency set up that is predominantly staffed or represents the social work profession. So in the registration board at the moment, it has 10. 6 must be social workers. And when you have the Complaints and Disciplinary Tribunal, again, social workers have to be the majority. It introduced the notion that employers or contractors or funders would determine whether the role required a social worker. It was getting a bit scary. And the reason for that was they didn't want to capture other professions like school guidance counsellors, youth workers, probation officers, whānau ora workers, navigators and so on and so forth. They saw social work overlapping with all of those. The Cabinet Minute of Decision, which is Minister Tolley's advice to the Select Committee, wanted protection of title, fine. But, and this is where the sting comes in, only require registration if the job title or statutory position title used the word social worker. So we were seeing now the splitting of the profession significantly, and what I'll talk about now. So August last year, the last thing the national government did before they went on the electioneering path, was to pass the first reading and refer the bill to Select Committee. So we were back to Select Committee. The major concern with the bill, a person is practising as a social worker, paid or voluntary, in a position that's described using the word social worker. We had quite a lot to say about that. But there was also a lot in the bill we supported as we got ready for Select Committee. Select Committee, of course, closed on the 30th of January, so I haven't had my annual leave this year. We supported mandatory registration. We supported protection of title. We supported the 2-year transition. We supported the removal of competence and recertification unless there was a concern about somebody's competence. And we wanted to maintain the majority of social workers both on the registration board and in the complaints and disciplinary tribunal. So those were some of the kind of gutsy things. We also proposed some new sections. Section 101 and 102 require the registration board in 101 to consult with Māori, and 102 they require the registration board to consult with Pacifica. We thought it was really appropriate to have a clause in there that specifically required the Social Work Registration Board to consult with social work professional bodies in Aotearoa New Zealand. We wanted it clarified that if you were provisionally registered, you needed to have the qualification and then were working towards meeting the other 6 criteria for registration. So that's competence to work with Māori, with diversity, competent, fit, sufficient English, so those sorts of things, and sufficient practical experience. We thought it was appropriate to include a clause out of the HPCA which required employers to report if somebody was dismissed or resigned on the basis of lack of competence. Because what can happen right now, and particularly while we're in the voluntary world, and particularly if the bill doesn't change, I could be doing something incredibly bad, leave before my employer sacks me, come over here and get a job without having told anyone about it. So that was a way of trying to protect the public and making sure that where there was somebody who was demonstrating lack of competence couldn't just go and get another job. We wanted the requirements, the alignment of the requirements to report with the Human Rights Act and Employment Relations Act, and I will talk in a later slide about what those reporting requirements are. We wanted principles of natural justice embedded. We wanted recognition of the 3 official languages, and we asked that Select Committee recommend to Cabinet that the Oranga Tamariki Act and the provisions around delegating to non-social workers be removed. But if we come to all of the information that went to the Select Committee and to Cabinet talked about the fact that social work couldn't be defined. It was too diffuse at the outer edges. And the social work and social work tasks were particularly difficult to define. And we argued very vigorously that that was not the case. We promoted very strongly the international definition of social work from IFSW. So I put this together. I've used this when talking with Ministry of Social Development officials. They talked about this capture of guidance counsellors, youth workers and probation officers. So what I tried to do was, because what their fear is, particularly MSD and to a greater extent the Minister, that if we talk about guidance counsellors, that the registered psychologists, the registered psychotherapists, the registered teachers, the counsellors, whether they're with NZAC or NZCCA, would all have to become registered social workers. Pardon? I don't quite see how that worked. So that's not the case. The teacher will be registered with the Education Council. the psychotherapists and the psychologists will be registered under the HPCA. Same with probation, same with youth workers. You know, the worry is all youth workers would have to be registered. Neither the Minister nor MSD seem to get their heads round the fact that the first step in registration was having a recognised social work qualification. And that if you didn't have that qualification, you can't register. I think this diagram might have helped a little bit. So that was just a bit of fun. So this is the definition of practising social work, which I hope you're all familiar with, fiercely familiar with. What the Select Committee did was they added in or social work to the definition. Social worker is a protected title under Section 6 AAA, which is the bit that talks about mandatory registration. Social work is not mentioned in that section and is generally accepted that some of the tasks that would fit under social work do overlap with some of those other professions in some levels. So there's problems with that in itself. One of the things that happens after a select committee is that the MSD writes a departmental report. So the MSD was appointed as the advisors to the select committee. So they were the ones that got to see all of the submissions, heard all of the submissions, and then they do the select committee report to select committee. This was fascinating, and if you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to have a look at it because it is frightening. And I just picked out a few key points. 60% of the submissions were in favour of reducing the transition period for Section 13 from 5 years to 2 years. MSD recommended no change. No rationale for why, just no change. Almost 80% of the submitters commented that the definition by title was inadequate. MSD recommended no change. 70% of the submitters wanted a scope of practice. MSD recommended no change. What I've now learnt is the reasons why there was no change, and it was to do with their concern about professional capture. And professional capture had two parts to it. There was this notion that all youth workers, all guidance counsellors, all probation officers would have to register. But there was also a worry that when you retired or gave up social work and went and did something at the Food Bank, Salvation Army, Citizens Advice Bureau, that you would have to be a registered social worker and have a practising certificate. So it was getting kind of really crazy. So we ended up with so that was the recommendations to the Select Committee, having analysed all the submissions. So what we got out of it was 6AAB stayed, that's the definition of practising as a social worker, but it was expanded to include the word social worker, which I've also referred to. And then there's a really bizarre section that they've put in, which says that a social worker is not practising as a social worker if they are employed in a role where social work is one of several qualifications that would be relevant for the job, and they don't call themselves a social worker. So this was really to get round things like the guidance counsellors and the probation officers, because certainly probation requires a tertiary qualification, preferably psychology, social work, or sociology. So the person who's appointed as a social worker would not be deemed to be practising social work if they were in that role and didn't call themselves a social worker. That seems to me to be putting a lot of dosh into the lawyers' pockets. So what's this has just opened the way for employers to determine who is and is not a social worker. I would get a call a week, and have been since August last year, from members who ring and say, my job's being in the process of being reviewed or has just been reviewed. I'm no longer called a social worker. My employer is no longer paying my registration fee. My employer is no longer supporting my membership. I'm having difficulty getting PD. And I say, and have your clients changed? No, the client group they're working with hasn't changed. The type of work they do hasn't changed. It's just that they've had those words removed from their job descriptions and their employment contracts to get round the necessity for employers to pay registration fees, APC fees, and membership fees, which is quite frightening. But I think there are a number of employers who have seen the bill and thought, if we get in now, we'll be okay. So what's ANZASW been doing in the last few weeks? We've had 2 meetings with Minister Sepuloni. That was as much, the first one was as much around education as it was about anything, around saying, well, you know, social work is unique, social work is an academic profession, yes, and you need qualifications. The second meeting occurred because through a whole series of conversations with various people, Minister Sepuloni came to the conclusion that she would be open to having some alternatives to Section 6AAB presented to her by ANZASW. So Shannon Pakura, the President, and I went and sort of met with her to talk about what that might look like, what we thought. So in preparation for that, we also gathered together a group in Wellington of sector representatives. So there was people from education, PSA, SWAN, Social Service Providers Association, health, the social work educators. So a relatively small group. We spent the afternoon together thrashing out some alternatives that we were then able to take back to Minister Sepuloni. And I will put those up on the screen shortly. Minister Sepuloni thought that was eminently doable. She was open to including scope of practice in the legislation. But we didn't let up, because until we see the ink on the paper, you can't trust what people say. We had a media campaign outlining the concerns, and Emmanuel has managed that part of it for us, and getting opinion pieces, media releases, all sorts of stuff out into the media so people were aware of it. We did get a little bit of airtime on Morning Report and a little bit of airtime on Campbell. We wrote to all of the members of Parliament, and that was quite a deliberate strategy, because we were beginning to think at that stage we may have to campaign to have the bill voted down, which is bizarre. We've been agitating for 15 years for mandatory registration of social workers. But the reason for thinking we may have to vote it down is the bill as written is worse than what we've got now. There are 7,034 people on the social work register today. We think the profession is about 8,000 to 8,500. We've got 500 members who are qualified but not yet registered, so there's around 7,500 people eligible for registration. That is huge in an environment where it's voluntary. So it tells me that the profession knows what the benefits of accountability are, and like that. The bill, potentially, 50% of the people on the current register would no longer require an APC because they're employed in roles not described as a social worker. We've got 110 role titles just in our database. 53% of our members are employed in roles not described as social worker. And that's members who are qualified and registered. So it again underlines that this bill is decimating the social work profession. We've got meetings set up with Derek, well, we've now had the meeting with Derek Ball, New Zealand First. I don't know how many of you, did any of you listen to the first reading back in August? Derek Ball, New Zealand First, was the only person who spoke at the first reading who had one iota of a clue about social work and social work registration. He understood scope of practice and really challenged Minister Tolley about the fact there was no reference to scope of practice in the bill. Jan Logie, I'm still waiting to get a time with her. We've got time with Tracy Martin in July. It's the earliest we could get. And we've been meeting with MSD officials in family and community policy. These are the people who advise the minister. These are key people. And they have been some very interesting meetings. So this is what the working group came up with and presented to the Minister. So we wanted the current 6 AAB to be removed and replaced with this. And then we added an extra piece in which empowers the SWRB to develop scopes of practice. When Shannon Pekura and I met with the MSD officials on Tuesday of this week, we talked about this. We are vaguely hopeful that there will be some significant changes to 6 AAB. We're meeting again with the officials on Monday of next week, and I suspect that we should be a little bit further ahead in knowing what the changes are likely to be. There has been a signal that scope of practice will be included in the legislation. It's in a similar way that it's included in the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act. So we are making progress, but as I say, until the ink is dried on the paper, I'm not going to completely hold my breath. And we are negotiating with MSD to make sure that we get to see what their final kind of position is before it gets set in stone, so that we're able to influence. And I have to take my hat off to our President, Shannon Pekura, who has been fantastic, has been stunning through this process. She's really talented when it comes to dealing with government officials and keeping them on side, but actually being really firm and really clear. So it's been fantastic working alongside her. So any questions about the bill? Where we are? Because I've got something else to move on to that's equally concerning. No? Okay. This popped out of the woodwork, quite unexpectedly. A review of the issues and opportunities in social work education. Like, it popped out on a Thursday, and it was like there's going to be a meeting the next week. It's been commissioned by Minister Martin, who is the she's the Deputy Minister for Social Development and for Education. The review is being led by NZQA. And it turned out that NZQA has not got the faintest clue about social work. They didn't know that the Social Work Registration Board, under the legislation, must recognise social work programs. They didn't know that 4-year programs have been around for 40 years in some cases. So Massey's had the 4-year program is actually for 41 years. And that there were some that have had it for a considerable period of time and some were still transitioning. So there was an absolute lack of knowledge about social work education per se. They didn't know who were the key stakeholders in the sector, so when the first invites came out for the meetings, there was huge gaps in who was being invited. They didn't seem to understand that Oranga Tamariki employed about 26% of the social workers, that DHBs employed about 26% of the social workers, that the funded NGO sector employed about 26%, and then there's a little group that is sort of scattered all around all sorts of places. So it was a matter of trying to get them to engage with the whole sector. And there was no substantial evidence given to all of the sorts of things that were being said about the social work education. There's this big sort of statement that social workers at graduation are not fit for practice, that they can't facilitate family meetings, they don't know about mental health, they don't know about drug and alcohol, they don't know about human development, they're not capable of writing a coherent report. But not a shred of evidence was given to support those sort of statements. So as a result of the first sector meeting, everybody said, this is ridiculous. It was agreed that there are some significant issues with the practicum placements in terms of getting access to good practicum placements, getting supervision in practicum placements, getting to see a variety of social work practice while you're doing your placement. So, and then there were significant issues identified in the ARCO report research, which I'll talk about in a while, about how people are supported in their first year of practice. And so it was agreed that there would be a 6-month project looking at what should inform a good placement and how a first-year practitioner should be supported. We all felt reasonably comfortable about that. Then, Oranga Tamariki got the ear of NZQA. And it was as if Oranga Tamariki was the only player in the whole social work scene. And they are, again, campaigning that graduates are not work ready because they don't know all this stuff. They lack skills for modern social work. They claimed that there was no strong professional body. I had quite a lot to say about that. And I'm meeting the writers of that report on Monday to chew their ears. And they suggested, this was one of the gobsmacking statements, that the state was the major employer funder of social work education and was the major employer or funder of social workers. Therefore, the state should determine what is taught in a social work program. Oh my God. And so in some of my feedback, there's been this amazing chain of emails to reply all. I pointed out that doctors, nurses and teachers were all trained through state-funded programs. They were all largely employed by the state or funded by the state, and nobody in their right minds would presume that the state should be telling doctors, nurses or teachers what they learn in their professional education programs. So why, one wonders, should social work be any different? So again, thinking back to that bit in the value statement, social work is a valued profession. I don't think it is being valued, and it certainly isn't being valued in Oranga Tamariki. So what they proposed was a 2-year work program. And they wanted to identify core minimum knowledge and skills for all social work education programs. That's outlined in the program recognition standards that are managed and overseen by SWRB. And not only do they set the standards, but they do 5-yearly program recognition reviews and they do midterm reviews. So there's a constant look, and I'm sure that Raymond knows about those. And the stuff that has to go on around that, they're pretty rigorous. They want consideration to be given to a professional state exam, similar to nursing. This is supposedly the mechanism for having people to be work ready when they graduate. Now, if someone could explain to me how an exam is going to make people work ready at the end of a program, I'd be really pleased, because I can't work it out. And I figured I must be stupid or something. They want to see more innovation in routes towards social work education. And I think you should all be very concerned about this. The writers of this report are from England. The writers of this report are strongly in favour of the program known as Step Up to Social Work. And I suggest you Google it. Step Up to Social Work recruits top graduates from non-social work programs, the brightest people they can find out of non-social work programs. They put them into a 4 to 6 week summer school of intensive learning around social work practice. They've got 2 programs. One is working with children, one is working with mental health. You then do 12 months in the field on supervised practice, and guess what? At the end of that, you've got a Bachelor of Social Work. And then if you do another year in the field, guess what? You've got a Master in Social Work. And these guys are really keen on that as a model. They're kind of not admitting it, but actually you know that that's where they're starting to come from when they talk about the innovative routes to social work. It seems that we are struggling as a sector to minimise the voice of Oranga Tamariki in this process, but because it's so informal and the NZQA haven't yet sort of advised the Minister on what's what, there's no terms of reference for this, we don't know what the fundamental question is that needs to be addressed. So Oranga Tamariki thinks there's lots of things that are broken, but is that the common view? We don't know. Certainly, Registration Board met with Minister Martin just recently, and she was open to kind of thinking about it in the broadest sense, and I don't think she's sort of quite on the same page as where Oranga Tamariki might be, but we don't know. It's very scary. So what's already underway? So we've got this NZQA thing swirling around over here. There's some stuff already going on. I don't know about how many of you know about the ARCO Enhanced Ready to Practice research project, which has been running it's in its third year. Phase 1, they did a mapping exercise of 17 of the 19 social work programs. So they can now show you very clearly that things like human development, care and protection, mental health, drug and alcohol are all covered in programs. But they're not necessarily in a course called mental health and drug and alcohol. They're threaded through because that's how life is. We don't just have mental health over here in a nice little tidy pile. The gaps that they have identified in that research project is not human development, mental health, drug and alcohol. It's actually social work and the law. And the sort of laws that social workers often have to operate under. Phase 2 is being written up now, and in this phase they did a survey of newly qualified social workers, that's social workers in their first year of practice. They then did focus groups with social workers and supervisors around their readiness to practice, and some of what came out of that was frightening. People talked about not getting supervision. People talked about being given enormous caseloads. People talked about not getting support and advice. And where we think this is what's happening is that places like Oranga Tamariki are expecting new graduates to look like somebody who's been in practice for 4 or 5 years. They don't want to take the responsibility to orientate a new graduate into their particular organisation and meeting their particular needs. Phase 3 is sort of underway at the moment, and that what they will be doing in Phase 3 in this project is publishing by the end of this year a capabilities framework for Aotearoa New Zealand. And I've got the next slide shows what that might look like. And that will set out what you would expect somebody to be capable of doing when they step out of ARA's door or any other school's door. What you would expect that social worker to be able to do at the end of their first year of practice, and then what you would expect that social worker to be able to do after, say, 3-4 years of practice. They are probably going to apply for an extension of ARCO funding to be able to develop that further and look at advanced practice, excellent practice and management practice, which is similar to what is happening in the UK. So at the moment they're doing a lit scan to see what's out there, then they'll look intensely at the ANZASW Capabilities Framework, the Canadian Associations Framework, and probably a couple of others just to get a sense of what it will look like. They've very clearly signalled there will be a capability around competence to work with Māori. Also, as I've mentioned before, SWRB is reviewing the core competencies ahead of reviewing the program recognition standards. So there's a huge chunk of work that has been going on for quite some time that actually should be completed before NZQA go poking their noses into social work education. They were unaware of this. Enhanced Ready to Practice have gone and talked to them, and they just see this as a low level, well, we'll take it into account when we do the review, because what's coming out of this doesn't support the sort of statements that Oranga Tamariki are making. It is actually saying that there are some real issues with how organisations like Oranga Tamariki support their practitioners in their first year of placement. And I think an interesting stat is that Oranga Tamariki employ 26% of the New Zealand graduates, and how many percent do you think they take on placement? 10%. So little wonder that they argue that graduates are not placement ready, because they haven't had the opportunity to learn about working in that organisation. So this, I've just taken a few 3 lines out of the intervention and skills descriptor out of the ANZASW capabilities framework. So just to illustrate what it might look like, we'll have something similar. This has got 9 descriptors. I would think we may end up with 10, particularly by bringing in one around competence to work with Māori. But it just is trying to illustrate that what's reasonable to expect of your average person at new grad stage, end of first year of practice, and reasonably experienced. Reporting requirements. I thought I'd throw this in because it has potential to be quite spooky. An employer under the bill, and this would take effect the day after Royal Assent, an employer must report a social worker to the registration board if they believe on reasonable grounds that the social worker is not competent. Thank goodness they're actually requiring the employer to do something around trying to improve the competence before they report. If they believe the person has been involved in serious misconduct. There's no requirement in the bill to substantiate that belief. And if they believe on reasonable grounds that the person may be unable to perform the functions required of a social worker because of a physical or mental health condition. And it is so, if that's not enough, a social worker who believes on reasonable grounds that another social worker is, and it's different, may and is for the social worker, unable to satisfactorily perform the functions because of a physical or health condition, they must report promptly to the registration board their belief. And failure to report may constitute a professional misconduct, which then opens the way to the Complaints and Disciplinary Tribunal. And any person who believes that a social worker may be unable to perform the functions required of a social worker may report that. And we have that anyway, but not quite so explicitly. Why are these concerns? What we know, going back to 2003, 2004, when the Registration Act was first took place, employers used reporting to the Registration Board as a means of absolving themselves of their employment responsibilities. So it was easier to report to the Registration Board and cheaper than actually managing an employment situation in the workplace. So I think that this opens the way for that to happen. We also know, going back through complaint records, that social workers who fell out with each other for whatever reason often tried to resolve that dispute by reporting to the Registration Board, and we've now got fabulous grounds for that to happen. And any person who's believing that a social worker is not capable, that I think particularly would come from the likes of clients of Oranga Tamariki or clients who've had a family court access report written. Those are the sort of people who get really grouchy about those sort of things. I would argue that all of these things are appropriate reporting requirements for an accountable, regulated profession. And they're mostly in the HPCA. But my worry is that, as I said, employers could use it to avoid good employment practices. Employers could use it where they've got a grudge against an employee. And good God, I hear enough of that. Calls from members where it's clearly there's a grudge rather than a justifiable grounds. That social workers, again, could have a grudge, maybe they were in a relationship and it broke up acrimoniously. So what better way to kind of cause grief than to report? I would argue that under this bill, every social worker should have access to professional indemnity insurance, which, of course, is part of membership. But I just think people need to be aware of these provisions because they potentially have a long, long reach. So, there we are. And we've got 3 minutes before the scheduled end time. Questions, discussion, debate?
Lisa, just that last slide around kind of expectations on social workers, kind of the requirements, does that kind of contravene things like human rights? I've just noticed that the kind of the onus is on the one being informed on to obviously have to do something to prove something.
This particular set is a complete replication of what's in the Health Practitioners Competent Assurance Act. I don't know how often it's used, and it's not something that's easily tracked because the HPCA, of course, splits off into a whole raft of regulatory authorities, and you'd have to spend your time sorting through it. But certainly we know that doctors from time to time need to report on a colleague doctor because of something that they're doing that's not kosher and okay. I think it's about, if it was misused, yes, it could be a contravention of human rights and all of those sorts of things. What we asked for was that there was inclusion of a clause that said that if it was established that the reporting social worker had done so maliciously or vexatiously, that they could be subject to a misconduct. But the MSD that knows everything decided that wasn't necessary. Somebody else over here had a question?
A couple of comments. One is about external supervision being invaluable when you're working with agencies such as I do. It's just invaluable to not get caught up and just be prescribed according to what that agency rules, which often is counterproductive to social work values. So it concerns me many of the bigger government departments do not have that. Therefore, are social workers able to practice within their values, and how will that be addressed, and how will they be protected to stand up for their code of ethics and their values within those government departments? So that's one point. And the other point is the concerns about through financial pressures that many first-year graduates miss out on jobs because everyone wants their social worker work ready. Therefore, there's no incentive, there's no leeway and resources for people to take on new graduates. And I imagine with changes in economic situations in the community and NPO sector, that's going to get more difficult. So incentives for employers to be expected to accommodate new graduates. So new knowledge is coming in all the time with new social work graduates because that's what they bring.
Absolutely. One of the things that SWRB is working with TUC is looking at a supported first year of employment. One of the things that you just need to keep in mind is that social work degrees are funded as the same level as a BA. So they're not getting the professional level funding, which is tied into practicum requirements. So many of the other degrees where there is a practicum requirement, there is a payment to the people who are taking placements. So that facilitates the access of placements. So, and then things like nursing get a supported first year of practice. So the Registration Board is looking at that as a means of trying to protect people in their first year and make sure they get the sort of support they need to go on and become a competent practitioner. Supervision is a requirement of holding a APC, but it's not kind of enshrined. It's a requirement that can be set by SWRB. It's not enshrined in the legislation, and there's no obligation for employers to actually provide external supervision. I agree with you. It would be a fantastic move if we could get that, but I think the approach that we've taken as an association with the bill is that get the changes that matter, and then the bill's got to be reviewed in 2020. Or the Act has got to, in its entirety, has to be reviewed in 2020. So use that as the stepping stone to deal with the things that are annoying, but not as annoying as the definition of practising as a social worker.
You were going to come back to the time frame?
Time frame, yes. Thank you for reminding me. Once there is an agreement, so as I understand it, the officials are sort of working with law drafters around some potential changes to the Act, or the bill, as it is. Once that's sorted, it takes 2 months. It'll take a month, roughly, to get through law drafting. Then it has to go back to Cabinet. That takes about a month. And then it's got to go back into second reading. So, and then once it's gone through second reading, if there are no further changes, it could have third reading the same day, and that's something that sometimes Parliament tries to do to avoid having to deal with consequences of people not liking what they're doing. Or there can be a time lapse between. So I think we're probably looking at 4 to 5 months from now. It could be a little bit less, it could be a little bit more.
That's second reading? Or?
No, till we go to third reading and royal assent. So hopefully before Christmas, but don't know. So people who have got a recertification due, we're saying keep on track and get them done, particularly if it's due before the end of the year. I wouldn't be counting on having not having to do it.
Can I just give some feedback around the NZQA not really knowing about the social work education? And that may be another parallel about higher level kind of oblivion to what's going on, because the requirement is that recognition process is a joint process in New Zealand, and that's unique to some other countries. So they actually come with the registration board to the educational institutes and run that process together, and the actual standards are integrated. So yeah, where that kind of lack of knowledge is coming, it's not being fed up.
I think it's come the NZQA, the bit of NZQA that's involved in that review is not the same as the bit of NZQA that's involved in the program recognition, and they hadn't even gone and talked to their colleagues.
Correct. Yeah, because there's lots of other requirements at NZQA. We do lots of further reporting annually, particularly in the ITP sector. So whether they're fudging it or not knowing, or the voice is being driven somewhere else, but certainly they are required to be involved already. So and we're required to, it's mandated. So
It's one of these mysterious officials doing stuff and senior staff. So, okay, I'm getting fingers pointed at me. I've got 8 minutes over time. Yeah. So I think we probably need to wrap it up here. If you've got any questions, email me. If people want a copy of the PowerPoint, then I can send it to you.
That'd be great. Okay, so I just want to thank you so much for your really informative presentation. I feel like I've got so much more of a broader understanding, but more depth to my understanding of what's been going politically for social work. And this is such important stuff for us to be really cognizant of and keep up to date with. And so thank you for your good advocacy for the profession.